The October rain in Cedar Falls, Montana, wasn't the gentle kind that farmers prayed for. It was the merciless, bone-chilling type that turned dirt roads into muddy rivers and made even the strongest people question their decisions. Sarah Martinez clutched her 3-month-old daughter Emma closer to her chest as she stumbled down Main Street, her worn sneakers slipping on the wet pavement. The baby's cries mixed with the sound of raindrops hitting the cracked sidewalk, creating a symphony of desperation that seemed to echo off the empty storefronts. Most businesses had closed early due to the storm, their neon signs flickering like dying stars against the grey afternoon sky. Sarah's thin jacket, a faded denim piece she'd bought at a thrift store 2 years ago, offered little protection against the relentless downpour. "Shh, mi amor, we're almost there," she whispered to Emma in Spanish, the language of her childhood that always surfaced when her emotions ran high, but she wasn't sure where there was anymore. The motel room she'd called home for the past 2 weeks was no longer an option. The $23 in her wallet wouldn't cover another night, and the manager had made it clear that her time was up. Sarah's legs trembled as she passed Murphy's hardware store, its windows dark and unwelcoming. She'd applied for a job there 3 days ago, filling out the application with careful handwriting while Emma slept in her arms. The owner, a gruff man with calloused hands, had looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion before saying he'd think about it. She knew that was small-town code for don't hold your breath. The weight of her situation pressed down on her shoulders like the storm clouds overhead. 6 months ago, she'd been working double shifts at a diner in Phoenix, saving every penny for a better life. Then came the eviction notice, followed by the news that her mother, the only family she had left, had suffered a stroke back in Chicago. The decision to leave Arizona had seemed logical at the time. Use her savings to travel north, find work in a smaller town where the cost of living was lower, and somehow make it work. But logic and reality rarely aligned when you were 24, alone, and responsible for a baby whose father had disappeared the moment he learned about the pregnancy. Emma's cries grew louder, cutting through Sarah's thoughts like a knife. The baby was hungry. It had been 4 hours since her last feeding, and Sarah knew she couldn't delay much longer. She quickened her pace, her feet squelching in the growing puddles that reflected the dim streetlights beginning to flicker on. "Just a little further, sweetheart," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to Emma or herself. The bus station was still 6 blocks away, and she'd heard there was a family shelter in the next town over. If she could just make it there, maybe they'd have space for one more lost soul. The rain seemed to sense her urgency and intensified, turning from a steady downpour into a torrential assault. Sarah's wet hair clung to her face, and she could feel her clothes becoming heavier with each step. Emma's blanket, a soft pink gift from a kind nurse at the hospital, was soaked through, and the baby's cries took on a desperate edge that made Sarah's heart clench. She was passing the Cedar Falls feed and supply when her vision began to blur. The lack of food, the stress, the constant worry, it all crashed over her like a wave. She'd eaten nothing but a package of crackers and a cup of coffee in the past day, spending her last few dollars on formula for Emma instead of food for herself. The world tilted sideways and Sarah felt her knees buckle. She clutched Emma tighter, her maternal instincts overriding everything else as she realized she was falling. The wet pavement rushed up to meet her, and she twisted her body at the last second, ensuring that Emma would land on top of her rather than hitting the ground. The impact sent shockwaves through her body, but she held on to her daughter with every ounce of strength she had left. Emma's cries pierced the air, and Sarah could taste blood where she'd bitten her lip. The rain continued to fall, soaking through her already wet clothes and pooling around her on the sidewalk. "Help," she whispered, but her voice was barely audible above the storm. "Please, someone help." She tried to sit up, but dizziness washed over her again. Her arms felt like lead, and she could feel her grip on Emma loosening despite her best efforts. Panic set in as she realized she might not be able to protect her daughter much longer. That's when she heard the steady sound of boots on wet pavement, measured and purposeful. Through the haze of rain and exhaustion, she saw a figure approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark cowboy hat that seemed to shed water like it was made for this exact situation. The man moved with quiet confidence, his steps never faltering despite the treacherous conditions. He wore a brown leather jacket that looked like it had seen its share of storms, and his jeans were tucked into well-worn boots that spoke of long days and honest work. Without saying a word, he knelt beside Sarah, his weathered hands steady as he assessed the situation. His eyes, a deep brown that reminded her of coffee on a cold morning, met hers with an intensity that was both gentle and determined. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the subtle drawl that marked him as a native of Big Sky country. "You're going to be all right." Before Sarah could respond, before she could even process what was happening, the cowboy was shrugging out of his jacket. The movement was fluid, practiced, like he'd done this 100 times before. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He simply took off his coat without a word and wrapped it around Sarah and Emma, creating a shelter from the storm that felt like the first safe space Sarah had known in months. The jacket was warm, carrying the scent of leather and something uniquely masculine, cedar perhaps, or the faint trace of wood smoke. It was large enough to cover both mother and child, and Sarah felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks as she realized that someone, a complete stranger, had just offered her kindness without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice breaking. The cowboy's response was to gently lift Emma from Sarah's arms, cradling the baby with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. Emma's cries began to quiet, as if she sensed the strength and security in this stranger's embrace. "Let's get you both out of this rain," he said, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "My truck's right over there." As he helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight with one arm while keeping Emma secure with the other, Sarah caught a glimpse of the man who had just changed everything. He was older than her, maybe early 30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours under the sun and the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from living an honest life. His name, she would later learn, was Jake Morrison, and he'd been driving through town after checking on a sick horse at the veterinary clinic. He'd seen her fall from his truck window and hadn't hesitated to stop, to help, to offer his coat to a stranger who needed it more than he did. But in that moment, as the rain continued to fall and the cowboy's jacket wrapped around her like a promise, Sarah only knew that her luck had finally changed. Sometimes, salvation came in the form of a quiet man who believed in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Jake Morrison's truck was a 1998 Ford F-250, forest green with enough rust around the wheel wells to tell stories of Montana winters and muddy ranch work. The interior smelled like leather conditioner and faintly of hay, with a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror and a thermos of coffee nestled in the cup holder. As Jake helped Sarah into the passenger seat, she noticed the care he took to ensure Emma was secure before closing the door against the relentless rain. "Heat's coming up," he said quietly, starting the engine with a rumble that seemed to vibrate through Sarah's exhausted bones. The dashboard lights cast a warm glow across his weathered face, and she noticed the way his calloused hands moved with practiced ease across the controls, adjusting the temperature and directing the vents toward her and Emma. Sarah pulled his jacket tighter around herself and the baby, still unable to believe that a complete stranger had stopped to help. In Phoenix, people stepped over homeless veterans on the sidewalk without a second glance. Here, a man she'd never seen before had given her his coat without asking her name, her story, or what she might give him in return. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And this is Emma." Jake nodded, his eyes focused on the road ahead as he navigated the flooded streets. "Jake Morrison, pleasure to meet you both, though I wish it were under better circumstances." The truck's heater was beginning to work its magic, and Sarah felt the first warmth she'd experienced in days seeping into her bones. Emma had stopped crying, lulled by the truck's steady vibration and the security of being dry and warm. Sarah allowed herself a moment to study the man who had rescued them. Jake's profile revealed a strong jaw covered with a day's worth of stubble, and his brown hair was slightly mussed from wearing his hat. His clothes were practical, a faded blue flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms that spoke of physical labor. There was something solid about him, something that reminded Sarah of the mountains themselves, unchanging, dependable, built to weather any storm. "Where were you headed?" he asked, his tone casual but not prying. "Bus station," Sarah admitted, adjusting Emma's position in her arms. "I heard there might be a shelter in the next town over." Jake was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him processing this information. They passed the Cedar Falls Diner, its neon sign flickering in the rain, and she remembered the job application she'd filled out there just yesterday. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Betty, had promised to call if anything opened up. "That shelter's been closed for 2 months, Jake said finally. "Budget cuts." Sarah's heart sank. She'd been counting on that option, thin as it was. "Oh, but," Jake continued, turning onto a street lined with modest houses, their windows glowing yellow against the storm. There's a room above Murphy's hardware. Old man Murphy uses it for storage mostly, but it's got a bed and running water. He's been looking for someone to help organize his inventory in exchange for rent. Sarah turned to look at him, hope flickering in her chest like a candle in the wind. Really? Really? And before you ask, Murphy's bark is worse than his bite. He's got 3 granddaughters back in Billings, and he's got a soft spot for kids. Jake glanced at Emma, who was now sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. Plus, he needs the help. His arthritis has been acting up something fierce. They pulled up in front of Murphy's hardware, and Jake shut off the engine. The store was dark, but there was a light on in the apartment above, and Sarah could see a figure moving around inside. "He's up there?" she asked. "Lives above the shop. Has for 30 years, ever since his wife passed." Jake opened his door. "Stay here a minute, let me talk to him." Sarah watched through the rain-streaked windshield as Jake jogged to the side entrance of the building and climbed the external stairs to the apartment above. She could hear voices muffled by the storm, and after a few minutes, Jake reappeared with an older man she recognized from her job application earlier that week. Frank Murphy was in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of honest work. He wore a cardigan sweater and slippers, and despite the late hour, he seemed alert and curious rather than annoyed. Both men approached the truck, and Jake opened Sarah's door. "This is Sarah and Emma," Jake said by way of introduction. "Sarah, this is Frank Murphy." Frank's eyes softened as he took in the sight of the young mother and her baby. "Heard you filled out an application earlier this week. Got it right here on my desk, matter of fact." Sarah's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Murphy. I know you said you'd think about it, and I wasn't trying to—" "Nonsense," Frank interrupted, his voice gruff but kind. "Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways. Had a feeling I'd be seeing you again." He gestured toward the apartment. "Come on up, let's get you both out of this weather." The apartment above Murphy's hardware was small but clean, with hardwood floors and windows that looked out over Main Street. The furniture was simple: a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a kitchenette that included a mini-fridge and a hot plate. But to Sarah, who had been living in a cramped motel room for weeks, it looked like a palace. "Hasn't been used in a while," Frank said, turning on the lights and checking the radiator. "But everything works. Heat, water, electricity, all included if you're willing to work downstairs." "What kind of work?" Sarah asked, though she would have agreed to scrub floors with a toothbrush if it meant having a roof over Emma's head. "Inventory mostly, organizing the stockroom, helping customers when I'm busy, basic bookkeeping. Nothing too complicated, but it needs doing." Frank glanced at Emma. "Baby-friendly hours, we can work around nap times and feedings." Sarah felt tears threatening again. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take it," Jake said quietly. He was standing by the window looking out at the storm. "Frank's offering you a fair deal." "More than fair," Frank added. "Truth is, I've been putting off hiring help for months. My back's not what it used to be, and climbing ladders to reach the high shelves is getting harder every year." Sarah looked around the small apartment, imagining Emma sleeping peacefully in the bed, imagining herself making breakfast on the hot plate, imagining a life that didn't involve constant worry about where they'd sleep each night. "When can I start?" she asked. Frank smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him. "How about tomorrow? Store opens at 8, but you can come down whenever you're ready. We'll start with showing you where everything is, and then you can organize things however makes sense to you." "Thank you," Sarah said, and this time she couldn't stop the tears from falling. "Thank you so much." Jake stepped forward and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank us. This is what neighbors do." As if sensing the emotional weight of the moment, Emma stirred in Sarah's arms and opened her eyes, looking around the room with the curious expression babies get when they find themselves somewhere new. She didn't cry, just observed, as if she too understood that this place might be the beginning of something better. "I should let you get settled," Jake said, heading toward the door. "Frank, you need anything else before I head home?" "I'm good, son. Thanks for bringing her by." Frank turned to Sarah. "There's some soup in the fridge downstairs, and I've got formula if you need it. My granddaughter left some behind last time she visited." Sarah watched as Jake prepared to leave, and suddenly she realized she was still wearing his jacket. She started to take it off, but he held up a hand. "Keep it tonight," he said. "I'll pick it up tomorrow when I come by to check on you. You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," Jake interrupted, his brown eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "But I want to. Sometimes that's enough." And with that he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with Frank Murphy and the beginning of hope she hadn't felt in months. The first rays of October sunlight streaming through the apartment windows woke Sarah from the deepest sleep she'd had in weeks. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the gentle sounds of Main Street coming to life below. The distant rumble of delivery trucks, the cheerful chime of the post office door, the friendly greetings between early morning commuters who'd known each other for decades. Emma was still sleeping beside her, curled up in a nest of blankets that Frank had brought up the night before. In the daylight, the small apartment felt even more welcoming than it had in the storm. The hardwood floors gleamed with years of careful maintenance, and the windows offered a view of the Beartooth Mountains in the distance, their peaks dusted with early snow that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Sarah stretched carefully, mindful not to wake Emma, and padded to the small kitchenette. True to his word, Frank had left soup in the mini fridge, along with fresh bread, milk, and a can of formula. There was even a note written in careful script. "Welcome to Cedar Falls. Coffee's downstairs when you're ready," was FM. The kindness of strangers. It was something Sarah had read about in books, but never experienced firsthand until yesterday. In Phoenix, she'd been just another face in the crowd, struggling to make ends meet in a city that seemed designed to chew up people like her and spit them out. Here, two men she'd never met had offered her not just help but hope. She was making coffee on the hot plate when she heard footsteps on the stairs outside. A gentle knock followed, and Frank's voice called out, "Sarah, you awake? Come in," she called back, wrapping Jake's jacket around her shoulders. She'd slept in it, finding comfort in the lingering scent of leather and cedar. Frank entered with a tray containing a steaming mug of coffee, a plate of scrambled eggs, and what looked like homemade biscuits. "Thought you might be hungry. It's nothing fancy, but it's hot." Sarah's stomach growled audibly at the sight of real food. "Mr. Murphy, you don't have to—" "Frank," he corrected gently, "and I don't have to do anything except what feels right. My Martha always said that taking care of people was the best investment you could make." He set the tray on the small table and glanced at Emma, who was beginning to stir. "Beautiful baby. Looks like she's got your eyes." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "She's a good sleeper usually. I was worried she might keep you up. These old ears don't work as well as they used to," Frank said with a smile. "Besides, I've missed having young voices in the building. Gets too quiet sometimes." They were interrupted by the sound of boots on the stairs, followed by another knock. Frank went to answer it, and Sarah heard Jake's familiar voice. "Morning, Frank. Thought I'd check on our new neighbor." Jake entered, removing his hat and nodding to Sarah. He looked different in the morning light, less like a mysterious savior and more like a man who worked with his hands and took care of business. His flannel shirt was crisp and clean, and his jeans were worn but well maintained. He carried a paper bag from the local bakery. "Morning," he said to Sarah, his brown eyes serious but warm. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, then gestured to his jacket. "I should give this back to you." Jake waved off her concern. "Keep it as long as you need it. I brought something for the baby." He held up the bakery bag. "Thought you might need some proper food for breakfast." Emma chose that moment to wake up, her clear blue eyes focusing on the three adults with the curious attention of a baby who was well rested and safe. She didn't cry, just made the soft, cooing sounds that meant she was content. "May I?" Jake asked, and when Sarah nodded, he lifted Emma from the bed with the same gentle confidence he'd shown the night before. The baby settled into his arms immediately, one small hand grasping at his shirt. "You're a natural," Frank observed. "Been around many babies." "My sister's got 3, Jake replied, his voice taking on a softer quality as he spoke to Emma. "This one's prettier than all of them combined, though." Sarah felt something flutter in her chest as she watched this quiet, strong man holding her daughter. There was no awkwardness, no masculine discomfort with the task. He simply held Emma as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "So," Frank said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot downstairs, "ready to see what you're getting yourself into?" The next hour was a revelation. Murphy's Hardware was a maze of organized chaos that had been decades in the making. The main floor was divided into sections: plumbing, electrical, gardening, tools. But within each section, items were arranged according to a system that seemed to exist only in Frank's mind. The stockroom was even more challenging, with boxes stacked floor to ceiling and inventory lists that hadn't been updated in years. "I know it looks intimidating," Frank said, gesturing at the maze of merchandise, "but there's a method to the madness." Sort of. Sarah walked through the aisles, Emma in her arms, taking in the scope of the project. It was daunting but also exciting. She'd always been good at organizing, at finding patterns and creating systems. In Phoenix, she'd helped reorganize the diner's supply closet in her spare time, turning a chaotic mess into a model of efficiency. "Where do you want me to start?" she asked. "Wherever makes sense to you," Frank replied. "Jake here is our best customer, so he might have some ideas about what folks actually need versus what we just have." Jake, who had been examining a display of weathered fence posts, looked up. "The main thing is making sure people can find what they need. Right now the deck screws are in 3 different places, and I've seen customers give up and go to the big box store in Belozed rather than hunt for basic supplies." "That's a problem," Sarah agreed. "What if we start with the most commonly requested items? Create a system where related products are grouped together with clear signage." Frank's eyes lit up. "Now you're talking. My back's been telling me for years that I needed to reorganize, but I never knew where to start." They spent the morning going through the store, with Jake pointing out the items that moved fastest and Frank sharing stories about the quirks of Cedar Falls customers. Mrs. Henderson only bought paint in 1-quart cans because she changed her mind about colors frequently. The Kowalski brothers from the Double K Ranch bought nails by the case but always needed to inspect each box personally. Tommy Reeves, the local handyman, had a standing order for specific size bolts that he picked up every 3rd Thursday. As they worked, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. The work was physical but not overwhelming, and both men seemed genuinely interested in her ideas. More importantly, they included Emma in their conversations, with Frank making silly faces at the baby and Jake carrying her when Sarah's arms got tired. "You're good at this," Jake said as they took a break for lunch. Sarah had created a preliminary layout for the main floor that would group related items together while maintaining Frank's preferred traffic flow. "I like solving puzzles," Sarah replied, "and this is a really big puzzle." "Well, you're solving it better than I ever could," Frank said, studying her diagram. "This makes sense. I can see where everything goes." That afternoon, as Sarah began the actual work of reorganizing the first section, she realized something had changed. Not just her circumstances, but something deeper. For the first time in months, she felt useful, not just as a mother to Emma, but as a person with skills and ideas that mattered. Jake stayed until late afternoon, helping move heavy boxes and offering quiet encouragement. When he finally prepared to leave, he lingered at the door. "You're doing good work," he said simply. "Frank's lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Sarah replied. "I can't believe this is really happening." "It's happening because you're making it happen," Jake said. "I'll stop by tomorrow, see how the reorganization is going." As his truck pulled away, Sarah stood in the doorway of Murphy's Hardware, Emma in her arms, watching the sun set over the mountains. 24 hours ago, she'd been collapsed on the sidewalk in the rain, with no idea where her next meal would come from. Now she had a job, a place to live, and something she'd almost forgotten existed, a future. 3 weeks into her new life in Cedar Falls, Sarah had found a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. The early morning feeding with Emma, coffee with Frank downstairs, then hours of satisfying work reorganizing the hardware store. The project was progressing faster than anyone had expected, and customers were already commenting on how much easier it was to find what they needed. Jake had become a regular fixture in the store, stopping by most days after his work at the Morrison Ranch, a sprawling cattle operation that had been in his family for 4 generations. He'd helped move heavy inventory, test Sarah's new organizational system by looking for various items, and often stayed for dinner that Frank would prepare in the small kitchen behind the store. It was during one of these peaceful evenings that Sarah's phone rang. She was feeding Emma in the apartment upstairs, watching the last light fade from the mountains, when the unknown number flashed on her screen. For a moment, she considered not answering. Most calls from unfamiliar numbers were telemarketers or debt collectors, but something made her swipe to accept. "Hello, Sarah? Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." The voice made her stomach drop. It was her mother's neighbor from Phoenix, Mrs. Rodriguez, and she sounded frantic. "Mrs. Rodriguez? What's wrong?" "It's about your mother, Mija. She's been asking for you. The doctors in Chicago, they say she's not improving the way they hoped. She keeps asking when you're coming to visit." Sarah's heart clenched. She'd left Phoenix with the intention of making enough money to visit her mother after getting settled. The stroke had been severe, and long-distance phone calls had been difficult because of her mother's speech problems. But Chicago was still hundreds of miles away, and she had no savings, no car, no way to make the trip. "How is she really?" Sarah asked, moving to the window so she could see the lights of the store below. "Not good, Mija. The doctors say she's stable, but she's not herself. She's confused most of the time, and when she's lucid, she cries because she can't understand why you haven't come. Sarah felt tears threatening. I want to see her. I've been trying to save money for a bus ticket, but there's something else, Mrs. Rodriguez interrupted. That man came by again, the one who was looking for you before. Sarah's blood ran cold. Miguel? Yes, he knows you're not in Phoenix anymore. He's been asking questions about where you went, about the baby. He seemed angry. Miguel Santos, Emma's father, the man who'd claimed to love Sarah until the moment she told him she was pregnant, then disappeared for 48 hours before returning to suggest she take care of the problem, or she'd be doing it alone. Sarah had chosen to do it alone, but the fear of Miguel's unpredictable temper had been one of the reasons she'd left Phoenix. Did you tell him anything? Sarah asked, instinctively holding Emma closer. Of course not, but he's persistent. He even went to your old job at the diner. The manager there said he was asking about unemployment benefits, about where you might have gone for work. Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Miguel had never shown any interest in being a father, but he had shown interest in controlling her. When she'd told him she was leaving Phoenix, he'd first tried to convince her to stay, then threatened to make sure she regretted it if she did. I need to think about this, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Be careful, Mija. I don't trust that man, and maybe you should try to see your mother soon, while you still can. After the call ended, Sarah sat in the growing darkness of the apartment, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. The security she'd felt building over the past weeks suddenly seemed fragile, like a house of cards that could be knocked down by a single wrong move. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Frank's voice called out, "Sarah, you missed dinner. I saved you a plate." "Come in," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. Frank entered with a covered plate and immediately noticed her distress. "What's wrong?" Before Sarah could answer, Jake appeared in the doorway. "Saw your light on. Everything okay?" Sarah looked at these two men who had become her safety net, her lifeline to a better life, and felt the weight of her complicated past pressing down on her. "I need to tell you both something," she said slowly, "about where I came from, about Emma's father." They sat around the small table, the untouched dinner growing cold, as Sarah told them about Miguel, about his temper, his possessiveness, his complete abandonment when she'd needed him most, about the fear that had followed her from Phoenix, the worry that he might someday decide he wanted to be part of Emma's life, but only on his terms. "He's been looking for me," she concluded, "and my mother in Chicago is getting worse. I don't know what to do." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his jaw set in a way that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "This Miguel," he said finally, "is he dangerous?" Sarah considered the question. "I don't think he'd hurt Emma, but he's unpredictable. When he's angry, he can be intimidating, and he doesn't like it when people don't do what he wants." "Have you been in contact with him since you left Phoenix?" Frank asked. "No, I changed my number and I've been careful about where I work. But if he's really looking..." She trailed off, imagining Miguel somehow finding his way to Cedar Falls, disrupting the fragile peace she'd built. Jake stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "You can't live in fear," he said. "And you can't let fear keep you from seeing your mother." "I can't afford to go to Chicago," Sarah said. "Even if I could, I don't have a car, and I can't take Emma on a bus for that long." "I'll drive you," Jake said, turning back to face her. "It's only 8 hours. We could make it a long weekend." Sarah stared at him. "Jake, you can't just..." "Why not?" he interrupted. "My truck's reliable, and I've got vacation time I've been meaning to use. Your mother is sick, Sarah. Some things are more important than worry about what might happen." Frank nodded slowly. "The boy's right. And as for this Miguel character, well, that's what we have phones for. If he shows up here, we'll know about it." "You don't understand," Sarah said. "He's not just some ex-boyfriend. He's Emma's father. If he wanted to make trouble, claim parental rights, then we'll deal with it," Jake said firmly. "All of us. But you can't make decisions based on fear of what might happen. You'll drive yourself crazy." Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, making the small sounds that meant she was waking up. Sarah looked down at her daughter's peaceful face and felt the familiar surge of protectiveness that had driven every decision she'd made since leaving Phoenix. "I don't want to bring trouble to you," she said quietly. "You're not bringing trouble," Frank said. "You're bringing life to this place, to both of us, and life is messy sometimes." Jake returned to the table, his expression serious but determined. "We leave Thursday morning. I'll call ahead to make sure the truck's ready for the trip. We'll spend 2 days in Chicago, then drive back Sunday. That gives you time with your mother and gets you back here before anything can go wrong." Sarah felt tears starting again, but this time they were from gratitude rather than fear. "Why are you doing this, both of you?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Jake said simply. "And because you're not alone anymore." Frank reached across the table and patted her hand. "That's what family does for each other. Family." The word hit Sarah like a revelation. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, without her realizing it, she'd stopped being a stranger passing through and started being part of something bigger. Frank, with his gruff kindness, and Jake with his quiet strength, had become the family she'd never had. "Okay," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. "Let's go to Chicago." As they made plans for the trip, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. But for the first time in months, it was mixed with something else: hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. The drive to Chicago began before dawn on Thursday morning, with Jake loading the truck while Sarah fed Emma one last time in the apartment. Frank had packed enough snacks and coffee to feed a small army, muttering about highway robbery at gas stations and the importance of being prepared. As they pulled away from Cedar Falls, the sun was just beginning to paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "Nervous?" Jake asked as they merged onto I-90, his hands steady on the wheel. Sarah shifted Emma in her arms, watching the familiar landscape of Montana rolling past the windows. "Terrified?" she admitted. "I haven't seen my mother since before Emma was born. I don't know how much she'll understand, or if she'll even recognize us." The drive gave them time to talk in a way they hadn't before. Away from the daily routine of the hardware store, away from Frank's gentle supervision, Sarah and Jake found themselves sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Jake told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the weight of carrying on 4 generations of family legacy. "My dad always said the land owns you more than you own it," he said, navigating around a semi-truck loaded with lumber. "But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just pick up and go somewhere completely different." "Like where?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "I don't know, maybe the coast, see the ocean, or Alaska. Help with the salmon runs up there." He glanced at her. "What about you? Before Emma, what did you want to do?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to be a teacher, elementary school. I was saving money for college when—" She gestured to Emma. "Life happened." "You could still do that," Jake said. "Cedar Falls Elementary is always looking for good people. The principal, Mrs. Chen, she's been trying to expand their programs." "I don't have a degree." "You could get one. There's a community college in Belozid and they have online programs. Frank would work around your schedule." The idea of going back to school, of having a real career, seemed both thrilling and impossible. "It would take years." "Years pass anyway," Jake said simply. "Might as well spend them doing something you love." They stopped for lunch in Billings, at a small diner that reminded Sarah of the one where she'd worked in Phoenix. Emma was fussy from the car ride, and Sarah walked her around the parking lot while Jake went inside to order food. That's when her phone rang. Miguel's number. Her hands shook as she answered. "Hello? Sarah, finally. Do you know how long I've been looking for you?" Miguel's voice was exactly as she remembered, smooth when he wanted something, with an underlying edge that could turn sharp without warning. "What do you want?" "I want to see my daughter." "Now you want to see her? Where were you when I was sleeping in my car? Where were you when I was working double shifts to pay for doctor visits?" "I made mistakes," Miguel said, and Sarah could hear the practiced sincerity in his voice. "I was young, scared, but I've had time to think, and I want to be part of Emma's life." Sarah watched Jake through the diner window, pointing to items on the menu and making the waitress laugh. The contrast between the two men, one who helped without being asked, one who disappeared when things got difficult, was stark. "You can't just decide to be a father when it's convenient for you," Sarah said. "I have rights, Sarah, legal rights. I've been talking to a lawyer." The threat was subtle but clear. Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "What do you want?" "I want to meet my daughter. I want us to work something out. I'm willing to help financially, but I need to know where you are, what your situation is." "I'm doing fine. I heard you left Phoenix with nothing. Where are you living? How are you supporting her?" Sarah realized that Miguel was fishing for information, trying to determine if she was stable enough to care for Emma, or if he could claim she was an unfit mother. "That's none of your business." "It's my business, if it affects my daughter." "She's not your daughter," Sarah said, the words coming out harsher than she'd intended. "You gave up any claim to her when you walked away." There was silence on the other end, and when Miguel spoke again, his voice had lost its false warmth. "We'll see about that. I know you're somewhere in Montana. It's a big state, but not that big. I'll find you, Sarah, and when I do, we're going to have a very different conversation." The line went dead, and Sarah stood in the parking lot, Emma in her arms, feeling like the world had tilted sideways. She'd known this confrontation was coming, but hearing Miguel's voice, hearing the barely concealed threat in his words, made it real in a way that terrified her. Jake emerged from the diner carrying takeout bags, and his expression immediately shifted when he saw her face. "What happened?" "Miguel called." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "He says he wants to be part of Emma's life. He threatened to find us." Jake set the bags on the hood of the truck and stepped closer. "What exactly did he say?" Sarah repeated the conversation, watching Jake's expression grow more serious with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He's bluffing," Jake said finally, "about the lawyer, about his rights. If he really had legal standing, he wouldn't be making threats. He'd have already filed papers. But what if—" "Sarah," Jake's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." She met his brown eyes, seeing the same steady strength that had first drawn her to trust him. "Whatever happens, we'll handle it. Together. Frank, me, the whole town if we have to. You're not alone in this." They reached Chicago by early evening, the city's skyline appearing through the windshield like a promise and a threat combined. Sarah hadn't been in a city this size since leaving Phoenix, and the noise and pace felt overwhelming after the quiet rhythm of Cedar Falls. The nursing home where her mother was staying was a clean institutional building that smelled of disinfectant and cafeteria food. Sarah's hands shook as she signed in at the visitor's desk, Jake standing beside her with Emma's diaper bag slung over his shoulder. "Room 314, the receptionist said kindly. "She's been asking about you." The walk down the hallway felt endless. When they reached the room, Sarah paused at the doorway, seeing her mother for the first time in over a year. Carmen Martinez looked smaller than Sarah remembered, her once vibrant hair now completely gray, and her face bearing the slack expression common to stroke victims. But her eyes, when they focused on Sarah, were still sharp and full of love. "Mija," she whispered, her speech slurred but understandable. "You came." Sarah crossed the room in 2 steps, wrapping her arms around her mother carefully. "I'm here, Mama. I'm here. Where have you been? I was so worried. I got your messages. I wanted to come sooner, but the baby," her mother said, her eyes finding Emma in Jake's arms. "Let me see her." Jake approached the bed, and Sarah's mother's face transformed as she saw her granddaughter for the first time. Emma, as if sensing the importance of the moment, was awake and alert, her blue eyes taking in this new face with curiosity. "She's beautiful," Carmen whispered. "Like you were." They spent the next 2 hours in that room, with Sarah's mother holding Emma and asking questions about their life. Sarah told her about Cedar Falls, about Frank and the hardware store, about finding a place where she felt safe. She didn't mention Miguel's call. When visiting hours ended, Sarah's mother held onto her hand with surprising strength. "Don't disappear again," she said. "Promise me." "I promise, Mama. I'll come back soon." As they walked back to the truck, Jake carrying a sleeping Emma, Sarah felt the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. The joy of seeing her mother, the fear of Miguel's threats, the overwhelming sense of standing at a crossroads where every decision would affect not just her, but the people she'd come to love. "You okay?" Jake asked as they reached the hotel where they'd reserved 2 rooms. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "Everything feels so complicated." "Life is complicated," Jake said, "but that doesn't mean it's not worth living." That night, as Emma slept in the crib the hotel had provided, Sarah stood at the window looking out at Chicago's lights and thinking about the choices ahead of her. Tomorrow they would visit her mother again, then drive back to Cedar Falls. But the questions Miguel had raised, the threats he'd made, would follow them home. For the first time since collapsing in the rain 3 weeks ago, Sarah felt truly afraid of what the future might hold. The drive back to Cedar Falls on Sunday afternoon was quieter than the journey to Chicago. Emma slept peacefully in her car seat, exhausted from 2 days of new faces and experiences, while Sarah watched the familiar Montana landscape roll past the windows. The visit with her mother had been both healing and heartbreaking, seeing Carmen's joy at meeting Emma, but also witnessing how the stroke had changed her. "She's stronger than she looks," Jake said, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. "Your mother, you can see where you get your resilience." Sarah smiled, remembering how her mother had insisted on holding Emma for nearly an hour that morning, speaking to her granddaughter in a mixture of Spanish and English, telling her stories about Sarah's childhood that made both women laugh despite everything. "She made me promise to bring Emma back for Christmas," Sarah said. I told her I would, but I don't know if... We'll figure it out, Jake interrupted gently. Whatever it takes. The word "we" sent a warm flutter through Sarah's chest. Over the past 4 days, Jake had become more than just a helpful neighbor. He'd become her partner in facing whatever challenges lay ahead, and the ease with which he included himself in her future plans spoke to something deeper than friendship. They were an hour outside Cedar Falls when Jake's phone rang through the truck's Bluetooth system. Frank's name appeared on the dashboard display. "Jake, where are you?" Frank's voice was tight with tension. "About an hour out." "Why? What's wrong?" "We had a visitor. Young man, maybe late 20s, driving a red sedan with Arizona plates. Said he was looking for Sarah and his daughter. I told him I didn't know any Sarah, but he didn't believe me." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Miguel had found them. "Where is he now?" Jake asked, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Gone, but he said he'd be back." He was asking questions around town, showing people a picture on his phone. Betty at the diner said she recognized the woman in the photo but didn't tell him anything. Sarah's mind raced. Miguel was here, in Cedar Falls, probably staying at the motel where she'd lived before meeting Frank and Jake. He would keep asking questions until someone told him what he wanted to know. "Frank, call Sheriff Morrison," Jake said. "Tell him what happened. If this guy comes back and causes trouble, we want it on record." "Already did. Your cousin said he'd keep an eye out." Sarah had forgotten that Jake's family had deep roots in the community. His cousin, being the sheriff, was just another layer of the protection network that seemed to surround her in this small town. "We'll be there soon," Jake said, ending the call. The remainder of the drive passed in tense silence. Sarah's mind churned with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Miguel could claim parental rights. He could drag her into a legal battle she couldn't afford. He could disrupt the peaceful life she'd begun to build in Cedar Falls. But as they crested the hill that offered the first view of town, Sarah felt something unexpected: determination. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had collapsed in the rain. She had a job, a home, people who cared about her. She had roots here, and she wasn't going to let Miguel's threats destroy what she'd built. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "I'm not running again." Jake glanced at her, something like pride flickering in his brown eyes. "Good. Running never solves anything anyway." They parked behind Murphy's Hardware, and Sarah was immediately enveloped in Frank's worried embrace. "Thank God you're back. I've been beside myself since that boy showed up." "Tell me exactly what happened," Sarah said, settling Emma in her carrier and preparing herself for the worst. Frank recounted Miguel's visit in detail. He'd been polite but persistent, claiming to be Emma's father and saying he just wanted to make sure his daughter was being properly cared for. When Frank had maintained his ignorance about Sarah's whereabouts, Miguel had left his phone number and a message. "Tell her I'll be at the Pineview Motel until Wednesday. After that, I'm involving lawyers." "He's giving me a deadline," Sarah said. 3 days to contact him or he escalates." "So we don't wait 3 days," Jake said firmly. "We deal with this now on our terms." Sheriff Tom Morrison arrived within minutes of their call, his presence both reassuring and official. Tom was Jake's cousin, a man in his 40s with the same quiet strength that seemed to run in the Morrison family. "Jake filled me in on the basics," Tom said, settling onto Frank's couch with a cup of coffee. "But I need to hear your side of the story, Sarah." Sarah told him everything, about her relationship with Miguel, his abandonment when she got pregnant, his recent threats, and his sudden appearance in Cedar Falls. Tom listened without judgment, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. "Here's the legal reality," Tom said when she finished. "If he's really Emma's father, he does have potential rights. But those rights have to be established through proper legal channels, not intimidation tactics, and his abandonment for the first 3 months of Emma's life works strongly in your favor." "What do you recommend?" Jake asked. "We control the meeting. Public place, neutral ground with witnesses. Let him say his piece, but make it clear that any legal action goes through proper channels. No more threats, no more hunting you down." They agreed to meet Miguel the next morning at the Cedar Falls diner, with Tom present in plain clothes and Jake and Frank nearby for support. Sarah spent a sleepless night rehearsing what she would say, holding Emma close and drawing strength from the baby's peaceful sleep. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the promise of early snow in the air. Sarah dressed carefully in her best clothes, a simple blue dress that Jake had complimented, and the boots Frank had insisted she buy for Montana winters. She wanted to look capable, stable, like a woman who could provide a good life for her daughter. Miguel was already at the diner when they arrived, sitting in a back booth with a cup of coffee and his phone. He looked exactly as Sarah remembered, handsome in a smooth way, with careful hair and clothes that were probably expensive. But seeing him now, after weeks of being around Jake's genuine strength, Miguel seemed somehow diminished. Sarah. He stood as she approached, his eyes immediately going to Emma in her carrier. "She's beautiful. Thank you," Sarah said, taking the seat across from him. Jake slid in beside her, a silent show of support that didn't go unnoticed. "This is Jake Morrison," Sarah said. "He's a close friend." Miguel's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in Jake's weathered hands and work clothes. "I see. And where exactly have you been living, Sarah? I've been worried about you and the baby." "We're doing fine," Sarah replied evenly. "We have a home. I have a job. Emma is healthy and happy." "That's good to hear. I've been doing some thinking since you left Phoenix, and I realize I made some mistakes. I want to be part of Emma's life. I want to help support her." "Where were you 3 months ago when I needed help?" Sarah asked. "Where were you when I was living in my car?" Miguel's practiced smile flickered. "I told you, I made mistakes, but I'm here now. I want to do the right thing." "The right thing," Jake said quietly, "would have been to be there from the beginning." Miguel's attention shifted to Jake, and Sarah saw a flash of the temper she remembered. "I don't think this concerns you. It concerns anyone who cares about Sarah and Emma," Jake replied calmly, "and that includes a lot of people in this town." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Miguel alternating between charm and veiled threats. He wanted regular visitation. He wanted input on decisions about Emma's care. He wanted Sarah to consider moving back to Arizona, where he could be more involved. Finally, Sarah had heard enough. "Miguel, if you want to be part of Emma's life, you can petition the court for visitation rights. But you don't get to show up and make demands. You don't get to threaten me or hunt me down. Emma and I have a good life here, and that's not changing." Miguel's mask finally slipped completely. "You can't keep my daughter from me forever, Sarah. I have rights." "Then exercise them through legal channels," Tom Morrison said, appearing beside their table and showing his badge. "Harassment and intimidation aren't rights." Miguel looked around the diner, suddenly aware that several locals were watching the conversation with obvious interest. In a small town, word traveled fast, and it was clear that public opinion was not on his side. "This isn't over," he said to Sarah, but the threat sounded hollow now. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "If you want to be Emma's father, prove it. But you don't get to disrupt our lives just because you've decided you're ready to be responsible." Miguel left without another word, and Sarah watched through the diner window as his red sedan pulled away from Cedar Falls, possibly for the last time. "How do you feel?" Jake asked, his hand finding hers across the table. Sarah looked around the diner at the faces of people who had become her community. Betty refilling coffee cups, Tom Morrison ordering pie, Frank reading his newspaper in the corner booth where he came every morning. She thought about the apartment above the hardware store that had become home, about the work that gave her purpose, about the man beside her who had shown her what real love looked like. "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. 6 months later, Sarah was enrolled in online college courses working toward her teaching degree. Emma was walking and saying her first words, "Mama, Frank," and inexplicably, "Hammer." Miguel had never followed through on his legal threats, apparently deciding that being a father required more effort than he was willing to invest. And on a warm spring evening, as Sarah organized the last of the hardware store's inventory overhaul, Jake Morrison got down on one knee in the middle of the paint aisle and asked her to marry him, with Frank grinning in the background and Emma clapping her hands from her playpen. Sometimes the best stories began with collapse, but they didn't end there. Sometimes they ended with a quiet cowboy, a coat offered without words, and the discovery that home isn't a place you find, it's a place you build, one act of kindness at a time.